During the Yuzhan-Vong War, the New Republic fell, with both its capital, Coruscant, and its ruling council devastated by the Yuzhan-Vong. Replacing it was the Galactic Alliance, a government which would stand for a century before it too was torn apart. As we discussed in a recent video, during the Galactic Alliance's reign, the GA made several major structural changes to its navy, centralizing the military and moving away from large multi-role capital ships to smaller, specialized vessels. Although this all sounds good in theory, or at least workable, it also gives us, especially when considered holistically, one of the dumbest capital ships in Star Wars, the MC140 Scythe. The Scythe was designed by the Mon Calamari during what can only be described as their bladed phase. The blade here is really the key feature of the ship, even more so than in its contemporaries. All of the MC-140's guns are centralized on the Scythe, as are the ship's hangars. The rest of the vessel is essentially just an armored engine and reactor. So what's the purpose of the massive blade? I guess to provide a structure to mount the guns, but it just really doesn't make sense to me. You could just make the ship a bit longer or whatever, but I guess it's not the worst thing ever, and it does look cool. However, what is problematic is that, as I mentioned, every single weapon on the ship is on the blade and only points forward. It doesn't even appear like the weapons can swivel. As the Essential Guide to Warfare and the Legacy Era Campaign Guide explains, the Scythe was meant only for head-on attacks, with the so-called cross of fire just being absolutely devastating. If the 140 was not in the correct position or the enemy was not in front of it, the entire ship had to move to re-aim. This is just nonsensical for a lot of reasons. First of all, the 140 is supposed to be fast. You would think it would want versatile weaponry so it could use its speed to perform complicated maneuvers like broadsides. Instead, basically, it's forced to fire on an enemy, then I guess loop around. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because all of the weapons were on the blade, the entirety of the ship's flank and rear were completely unprotected, with not even a single weapon offering resistance against enemies. If the target was outside of its firing arc or engaged it from the flank, the Scythe was literally defenseless. There were not even residual guns or point defense cannons on the main body. We'll come back to that because you can very easily achieve the goal of putting a lot of fire on a single target without sacrificing the rest of the design. So for example, still allowing your ship to, I don't know, shoot sideways, but as I said, back to that in a moment. The unique design may not have been a fatal mistake, but for the placement of the MC-140 in the Galactic Alliance's navy. I think a ship like this would work well in small numbers as a part of larger fleets. If it could be protected by more flexible cruisers and escort vessels which would protect its flank, while also helping ward off starfighters, or if other ships could maybe bring the battle to the enemy, keep them in the same place, as the 140 rained in fire from far away. But the problem is that with the Galactic Alliance, the Scythe is their most powerful capital ship and the backbone of their navy, easily the most common mainline cruiser, and it seems like the only ship of that class and tonnage that the faction even had. So, especially as the war progressed and the Galactic Alliance was essentially on the run, they were relying on a very specialized capital ship to perform all duties. In turn, that means the ship would just be not suitable for certain types of battle, and that the faction would have to rely on more limited tactics. The MC-140's strategy of constant maneuvering and hit and runs would definitely work well in specific situations, but it would also be naturally unsuitable for others. For example, I think the ship would have a hard time defending an immobile target or manning a blockade, basically a situation where the ship's speed will not be an asset. Not dissimilar to how Grand Admiral Thrawn pointed out that while A-Wings are good fighters, they're really terrible at escort duty because their greatest aspect becomes a liability. And when you focus on one area of a ship, that means that others necessarily suffer. Specialization is good, but for it to work on a fleet-wide level, there needs to be different ships which can not only do different things, but also work holistically together. They need to manage the weaknesses of each other, and where one ship does something poorly, another ship which does something very well should step in. And with that said, even given everything I mentioned, the MC-140 certainly could have been workable if the rest of the Navy was built around it. But instead, the vast majority of the Alliance's capital ships doubled double down on the specialization. Typically accompanying the Scythe was the Shawshore, which would be no help in situations where the MC140 is purely suited. It had weak armor and the similar forward-facing guns. According to the Legacy Era campaign guide, it foregoed strong defense in favor of greater speed and weaponry. There's also the Tri-Scythe, which is larger and heavier than the Shawshore, but which still relies on the so-called Cross of Fire. And until the GA started receiving Pelion Star Destroyers after the division of the Empire into the Fel and Scythe factions, they basically used ships exclusively built around this model. The Pelion and their later Imperious Star Destroyer, the Alliance, definitely did help, and they should be very, very thankful that they were able to capture some of those. There's also the problem that, in my opinion, this general idea of focusing fire on a single target is sort of poorly placed for this era. These ships would probably be really good at taking down something like a Super Star Destroyer. However, ships by the Legacy time were more flexible, they were faster, and they would be better able to evade the crossfire of the 140 while also taking the attack to their vulnerable areas. But to conclude, I did mention a couple of things earlier. One, that focusing a lot of firepower forward does make sense, and two, that there are better ways to do it than the MC140. The Scythe's, well, Scythe serves no purpose, and we can point to contemporaries of the Scythe, the Pelion for example, which employed this doctrine in a much better way. Most of the guns on the Pelion Star Destroyer were situated along the spine. Because the ship was slanted, even on a single plane, it could still effectively target enemies ahead with almost all of its guns, which could also swivel to deliver dangerous broadsides. So a better design offers the same opportunity, but with less inherent weakness. For the MC140 specifically, better options would be to just place the guns on the main body. If there's an issue with space, you could even maintain the Scythe while just moving some of the guns to the body. Put them on turrets. They can still fire forward on a single target with all of the ship's energy, but could also move to hit others. That way you better employ another one of the Scythe's strengths, its massive speed and maneuverability. Right now, for the relatively small capital ship to take on a Star Destroyer, it has to fly directly at it. Imagine if the guns could swivel to face on the rear. It could fly by, hopefully endure the broadside, then attack the ship in an extremely vulnerable location. All in all though, while I do like the Galactic Alliance Navy aesthetically, they've got some major problems with doctrine and fleet organization. And unfortunately, one of the starfighters protecting those big capital ships also has its view screen blocked by another blade. What was with the Mon Calamari of this era? Just, rotate the thing 45 degrees and it won't be in the way of the cockpit. Or maybe just, keep with the X-Wing. But that's all I have to say on this topic. I do feel really bad for any of the Alliance naval members who were forced to go against the far, far superior Pelion or Imperious class Star Destroyers in one of these buckets. Before we go though, we do have the hashtag AskEck question of the day. This one comes from Andrew, who asks, did the first Death Star have shields, and if not, would having them have changed anything? So both Death Stars did not have full shields, although the second Death Star did use one from Endor. That being said, certain aspects of the first Death Star, like the exhaust port, were shielded. There was what was called a magnetic field around the Death Star, although it didn't offer any sort of defensive capabilities, and you can see the X-Wings pass through that as they approach the station. The main difference, had the station possessed a shield, would depend on the type of shielding it used. A ray shield, which stops energy but not physical objects, wouldn't really have changed things because the X-Wings were fighting up close anyway, and presumably portions would have had to been lowered for the weapon to fire anyway. But a particle shield would have actually stopped fighters from passing through. This is why when fighting the second Death Star that the Rebel fleet had to pull away, because the shield was still up, and had they continued, they would have physically crashed into it and their ships would have been destroyed. Thanks for the question, Andrew. I hope that answers everything you were wondering. If you'd like me to address one of your ponderings at the end of a future video, make sure to leave it down below with the hashtag AskEck, and of course subscribe with notifications on, so if I do get to your question, you don't miss it. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. As always, have a great day, enjoy the release of Halo Reach on the PC, and may the Force be with you.